Welcome to today's webinar on Oracle when you can't apply Oracle security patches. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrity. I'll be the monitor for this e-learning session. Our speaker today is Stephen Coast. And Steve is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of the Integrity Corporation. He's been working on the Oracle product since 1994 with responsibilities that include database administrator, technical architect, IT security auditor, and applications administrator. Over the past 14 years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle e-business suite and the Oracle database, and has written and presented on these topics at various national and regional conferences, including the OAUG, IOUG, and the National Collaborative Conferences. I will now turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. So today we're going to talk about when you can't apply Oracle security patches. And what we mean by this is Oracle's releasing the critical patch updates on a quarterly basis. But what we found in our experience at Integrity is a lot of our clients aren't able to apply those security patches. And so typically what people do is, oh, I can't apply them. We'll just not apply them for a quarter, 2 quarters, a year, 2 years, 4 years. It's not uncommon for us to see a lot of different clients who just had never applied an Oracle security patch. There's a lot of different reasons for it. And so the crux of this presentation is to go through and talk about when you can't apply them, what else should you be doing? And so we're going to walk through, first, some of the reasons people aren't applying security patches, some of the issues with if you're not applying them, what's the impact to your organization potentially, and then recommendations what to do when you can't apply them. And there's varied reasons why you can't apply them, and we're going to try to walk through some mitigating controls to protect you from the risk. Oracle security patches contain a lot of very critical security vulnerabilities, and any one of those can be used to compromise your Oracle database or your Oracle e-business suite environment. Since over 2/3 of the people on the call today have Oracle e-business suite, we'll actually talk about the Oracle database first and then talk about the Oracle e-business suite. Before we go too far, let me introduce Integrity real quick for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Integrity was founded in 2001, and we specialize in Oracle security. We do Oracle security from both the e-business suite perspective and the Oracle database. We have a set of products, AppSentry, which is basically a security scanner to check if your Oracle database and Oracle e-business suite environments are secure. And then AppDefend, which is a specialized product that works with Oracle e-business suite to actually protect you from some of the Oracle security bugs that we're talking about today. And then we also have services, so actually a lot of the content of this presentation today is coming from our services where we do on-site security assessments. We work with a lot of different clients on how to protect themselves from different security risks in the Oracle database and the Oracle e-business suite. So a lot of the content today is actually driven by what we actually see at different client sites. So enough about Integrity. We'll kind of jump right into the topic today. So first we'll talk about the Oracle database, and then we'll actually talk about the Oracle e-business suite. So for the Oracle database, a lot of people are not applying security patches. And there's a lot of varied reasons for this, basically testing, support, downtime. What we found is actually there's primarily 2 major drivers. One is IT management and the DBAs are just not prioritizing security patches. They're not doing the periodic database upgrades that need to be done in order to have CPU support for a specific database version. And there's reasons for this that I don't blame a lot of people, that it's a significant effort to apply security patches. We were at a client recently and they had 100 production databases, and we started going through on the kind of the back of the envelope calculation on how long it would take them to actually apply the security patch. And we kind of figured maybe 8 hours or 16 hours to do initial testing. Then it was about 4 hours per database, just by the time you brought down the database, then brought it back up, downloaded the patch, got the patch applied, did some basic testing for 100 production databases, and they had about 3 databases that were test and development for each production. So we're talking 400 databases. And now we're all of a sudden talking about 4 hours per database. You're in about 1,600 hours to actually patch a large Oracle database environment. 1,600 hours, you're actually borderline on one full-time employee, one DBA. That's all their job to do would be applying Oracle database patches. You're probably having each DBA who's responsible for each production database apply the patches, but you're talking about one FTE applying security patches. And really, security patches don't provide you much business benefit. This is basically like insurance. You're just buying insurance so nothing bad happens. And not only is it insurance, most everyone probably on the call has a car, you're probably paying for uninsured motorist coverage. Well, uninsured motorist coverage is nothing that you're trying to protect yourself from. You're trying to protect against people out there who don't have insurance coverage. So security patches are like that. This is an Oracle problem. Oracle's got code quality issues, and so they're pushing the effort to fix their code quality issues that they incorporated security bugs in their product, and now they expect you to fix it by having to apply security patches. So there's really no business benefit. It's really just the security insurance to help you protect your databases from being hacked, attacked from either externally or internally. There are some technical limitations that we also find that a lot of clients have that they can't apply security patches. First is sometimes databases can't be upgraded because of application support. We ran into one recently that basically they were on a 10G database and the application vendor hadn't yet supported 11G, even though it's been out multiple years. Other times is there's no downtime window available. If you're running a database 7x24, it's really hard to bring down the database for a couple hours to apply a security patch. If you're running rack and things, you can actually do some rolling upgrades and no downtime depending on versions and things, but it's really hard to get these database security patches in. So mostly though we see it's an IT management prioritization issue, that people aren't sitting and saying, okay, we need to spend resources, time, and effort to actually get these database patches applied on a periodic basis, especially when they come out every quarter. That's a lot of patching every single year that you have to apply, especially if you have a large Oracle database environment. So that's kind of the main reasons that we see that people aren't applying the security patches. And there's some other reasons. Those are kind of the proactive reasons that people are deciding not to. There's also some reasons that are behind the scenes, that people don't understand what's happening on the CPU process, and they don't end up applying security patches even though they think they have. So here's a little quiz we'll start out with. So this is the registry dollar history table from an actual production database. As you can see, it shows you when the database has been upgraded and when CPU patches have been applied. So if you kind of look through the chart here, and the quiz is, okay, what CPU does this database have? So if you can kind of go through, you can see the database was upgraded February of this year from 10.204 to 11.202. And it did have the July 2011 CPU applied back in October 2011 on 10.204. So the question is, what CPU level is this database? I'll kind of give everyone a second to look at and to kind of make your decision. So A, B, C, or D. So the answer is actually B, January 2011. Probably a lot of people said, well, it's probably July 2011, not January 2011. Well, what happened was when they actually upgraded the database to 11.202, even though they had the July 2011 CPU installed, it actually reverted the CPU version back to January 2011. I can't tell you how many clients we experience this at, that the DBA say, oh yeah, we've got the latest security patches installed, no problem. And we actually go look and say, oh, by the way, you're 18 months behind. And they're like, that's impossible. We have it applied. We just upgraded the database, so we should be set to go. But what happens is when you're actually doing database upgrades, it's reverting your database CPU level to a previous version. And this chart clearly shows the different database versions and what CPU is included. So when you actually upgrade to 11.203, the version of the CPU in that database version is July 2011. No matter what CPU you have previously installed, as soon as you do a database upgrade, there is no internal versioning of Oracle database code. So it'll just happily write over any fixes that you've applied. So the CPU included in each Oracle database version, either a fresh install or database upgrade, is the one that was available when that patch or database version was released. This is very important. We probably catch 50% of our clients at least one or more databases with this problem. So then the second issue is basically when we're talking about CPU baseline version. So you've got the Oracle database upgrade patch, and now we've got the different versions included. But then also what Oracle has done is they actually have terminal CPU versions. So even though you've got a supported database version, that supported database version may not include, or the CPU support ends at a certain date. So if you're on 11.201 right now, the last CPU you could apply was July 2011. You actually have to do a database upgrade in order to have the latest CPU support.
Do you know anything how to do it?
And so when we kind of go through and look at the different versions, unless you're upgrading your database every 18 months, it becomes a significant problem. You always have to be doing database upgrades in order to have the latest CPU support. So we see a lot of databases out there that people are stuck for some reason on 10.204. The business just can't do a database upgrade to 11GR2 where they'd like to be, so they're now starting the process, but now they're just falling quarter after quarter behind because 10.204, the last CPU was July 2011. So a lot of customers are stuck in this situation where the CPUs are falling farther and farther behind because they can't do the database upgrades. So besides just prioritizing them, there are some technical reasons that people get stuck behind on the CPUs. So the rest of this presentation now we'll talk about what should you be doing if you are 18 months behind, 2 years behind, even if you're just a quarter behind. What are some of the things you can do to protect yourself and mitigate the risk of not having the security patches installed? Most organizations just accept the risk. We think that's foolhardy. There's a lot of very critical security patches that are easy to take over the entire database. And we've done previous presentations where we actually walk through the security patches. If you go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/integrity, you can actually see a presentation on how to exploit security vulnerabilities, and we actually pick 3 database ones and actually go through in detail and show you how easy it is to take over an entire database. So let's walk through a scenario here. We kind of picked one client example that we had. The client was actually on 11.202. It was one of their key production applications. And when they actually did the install of 11.202, they didn't apply any CPUs at that time. So they're missing all the way from April 2011 because 11.202 started with January 2011. So they, by default, by just installing 11.202, you got January 2011 CPU. But they've never applied a CPU since then. So they're missing April 2011 through April 2013. And this is a pretty typical scenario. Probably 2/3 of our clients are missing up to a year's of CPUs. Probably 40% are missing 2 or more years. So they're kind of stuck for 2 reasons. One problem that they have is that they have limited resources. So they're unable to apply CPUs on a regular basis. Their outsourcer really pushes back. They've got a fixed fee contract, so anything the outsourcer doesn't have to do, they don't do. So they really push back on trying to get CPUs applied on a quarterly basis. It was not written into the contract. The key application that they're running in this database hasn't been certified for 11.203 yet, so they're unable to apply that. They're kind of stuck on 11.202 for the time being, and I don't think the application vendor was going to release their certification for another year. I'm not sure why that was, but that's a very typical scenario that we see. So their CPU support will actually end at the end of this year, October 2013. They won't be able to apply any more CPUs, even though they haven't been. One of the mistakes they did make is when they were actually installing the database, they should have upgraded, applied the latest CPU when they actually applied the database. So when they installed 11.202, basically they got January 2011. If they had, at that time, it was February 2013, they could have actually installed the January 2013 CPU, which they should have done. It would have been included as part of all the testing. So in this case, they're missing 9 CPUs going back from April 2011 to April 2013, and there's 29 unpatched security vulnerabilities specific to this version. So when we're talking about 11.202 here, and I'll kind of take this as a scenario, that's similar. If you kind of go through each different version, you can kind of count up the number of security vulnerabilities. But in this case, for 11.202 specifically, they're missing 29 security vulnerabilities. And so the way we'll look at this is we'll look at the risks and threats. What is the risk of this Oracle database? And there's really 4 types of users that we're concerned about, 4 avenues of attack. The first is an unauthenticated user. So this is somebody without a database account. They're on your internal network, and they can connect to the database. They know the IP address, they know the port, they know the SID, so they're actually able to do a connection, but they don't have a valid database account. The second scenario is there's a low privileged user. This is somebody with basically create session system privilege only. And so therefore, the only permissions they have is public permissions. So they have I haven't granted them anything else, and they just have create session and public. The third scenario is a moderate privileged user. So this is basically somebody's got a little bit of access, probably create table, maybe create procedure, a few privileges. And then the fourth scenario that we talk about is a highly privileged user. And this is somebody basically with DBA-like privileges, or the DBAs themselves. So what we'll do is walk through these 4 different types of users, and these are really your risks and threats, where people are coming from. One we won't talk about today is maybe a SQL injection attack in one of your web applications. And that becomes much more complicated because now you're talking about 2 different security vulnerabilities. But there's a few other ways to exploit security vulnerabilities through other third-party applications. But these are basically mostly concerned with how people connect to the database and what can they do. So now if we take these 4 threats and risks and actually break out the 29 security vulnerabilities, and this is specific to 11.202, the farther you go back in database versions, the more there are. So if we're talking about maybe a 10.205 database or 10.204 database, we might have 30 or 40 security vulnerabilities. But this is very specific to 11.202, and we've got 29 security vulnerabilities. And then what we did was we went through each of those and what permissions were required. So 9 of those security bugs that are not patched in this one database could be exploited by an unauthenticated user. So this is basically I'm able to connect to the database, but I don't have a valid login account. Well, 7 of those 9 security vulnerabilities are denial of service attacks. And so that means I can typically crash the database listener. I think only one of those was I was actually able to crash the database, but most of them are crashing the database listener. So the database will stay up, but the database listener will crash, therefore no one can connect to the database. And only one security vulnerability of the 9 was actually really meaningful, and that's an issue with the login in 11G. So when Oracle released 11G, they changed the login mechanism a little bit, supposedly making it more secure, adding more features to it. But there's actually a vulnerability that allows you to partially connect to the database, and you can get enough information from the database, and they send you basically a token back, and you can actually brute force the end user's password using that token. So you're not actually trying to sign on with that account many, many times, but Oracle's sending you a token back, and you can actually use that token to try to figure out what the end user's password is for an account. Maybe let's say we're trying to do sys or system or DBM SMP using a known account, and you can try to figure out what the password is, and you take it offline. You don't even have to try it over and over against the database. You can do it offline. So that's a pretty critical vulnerability. In terms of low privileged users, again, this is our user that only has public permissions. They're allowed to connect to the database, but they don't really have access to any data or anything else, but they are allowed this hundreds and hundreds of packages that Oracle has granted to public by default. Well, almost every CPU has one of those type of vulnerabilities that is granted to public. So even though I have a lowly privileged user, that lowly privileged user can actually take over the entire database by exploiting one of these 7 security vulnerabilities. So in terms of risk here, the top 2 ones are most critical: an unauthenticated user or a lowly privileged user. If I've got a moderately privileged user, typically the system privilege required would be create procedure. There's a lot of security vulnerabilities within the Oracle database that are SQL injection and things like that within the standard database packages, and the easiest way to exploit them is if I can create a procedure that I can call. That procedure ends up being called as sys, and therefore I can then get sys privileges. I can grant myself DBA. I can do anything the sys user can do. And those are pretty powerful. So even if you have a user with just create procedure, and typically they're assigned create procedure, create index, create table, but the create procedure is the one that is most exploitable. And then out of the 29 vulnerabilities, 7 out of the 29 were actually highly privileged users. So I needed sysdba, I needed to be able to maybe create directories, create libraries, things that typically wouldn't be granted to an ordinary user. And very seldom are granted outside of the DBA group. These vulnerabilities, the kind of the 7 here that are highly privileged users, typically are mostly related to if you're running something like database fault. So if you're running database fault, you're trying to protect against these DBAs, these highly privileged users, and maybe shield some sensitive data from them and things like that. And typically, they would be able to circumvent those controls. In my opinion, if you've got DBA privileges and you can bring up and down the database, if you're applying patches to the database, you can take over the entire database anytime you want. It's very difficult to protect against those users. If you're granting some limited permissions, allowing them to do database backups, things like that, you've got a little bit more control over that user. But typically, DBAs have full run of the database, except maybe in highly secure environments, government type environments. So this is kind of how the CPU bugs are distributed out and kind of what the risk level across these different threats are. Mostly what we're concerned about is those unauthenticated users and the lowly privileged users. So now what we're going to talk about is how do we protect against those? So we've got a database here, and what should we be doing? We know we can't apply CPUs. Well, the first thing you should always do is at least start with a base level CPU. Don't get behind. This is kind of one of the biggest mistakes we see when we're actually doing client security assessments, is that when you're doing database installations and upgrades, people are not applying the latest CPU. Whenever you do an install or an upgrade, you should always apply the latest CPU, because that install and the upgrade most likely don't include the latest CPU. From the chart I showed previously, if you just install 11.203 database right now, you're going all the way back to January 2011. Well, if you're installing a brand new 11.203 database, there's no reason not to apply the latest CPU. One of the questions we get is, okay, should I really be applying the latest CPU? Or typically most clients go through maybe a 90-day upgrade testing cycle. So I apply it to development, I apply it to test, and I finally apply it to the production environment. Well, our answer for that is if you're running a patch set update or a security patch update. For those of you not familiar on the call with the Oracle terminology for critical patch updates, well, there's a critical patch update, and that's basically the security bugs released. The actual patches are called patch set updates, PSU, or security patch updates. And I'll talk a little bit more about the difference. But PSUs include more than just security fixes. And so for your production environment, if you're applying PSUs, you should really apply the PSU from the last test database. And so the scenario we typically see is customers go through and have development, test, production. It takes them 90 days to get through that cycle before they finally get it applied to production. What they do is they take the oldest CPU and apply it to development. Then they apply the same CPU to test, even though a new one may have come out, and then they finally apply it to production. So when they finally get the CPU applied, they're actually behind already. Well, our recommendation is if you're applying a PSU, when you get to the last test database before you apply it to production, make sure that's the latest CPU. If you're running security patch updates, which are only security fixes, when you're applying it to production, even though you haven't tested the latest SPU, we believe you should actually be applying that. So in test, you may have applied January 2013, and you tested that out. Now you're getting ready to apply to production today. Well, April 2013 has come out. We actually believe even though you haven't tested April 2013, you should apply April 2013 to production. The risk and the problems associated with CPU patches are very minimal, and we see very few problems. If it doesn't apply in the beginning, that's usually when you have a problem. Very seldom will you ever apply an SPU patch and actually find problems later on. There's just not that many fixes. The fixes within the SPU patches are very minimal, and they're almost always fixing anomalies in the code. So they're not fixing the way the code works. They're fixing, well, the developer didn't anticipate a certain type of input and wasn't properly validated. So if you pass in really bad input, that's typically what a security bug is. A security bug is, well, the program's not working correctly. That's a very small fraction of them. Most security bugs fixed in the Oracle database are the Oracle code is not anticipating a certain amount of input. In terms of a buffer overflow, well, a typical database name is limited to 250 characters. Well, that's a valid database name, so the developer just assumes somebody will pass in something that's under 250 characters in length. Well, if you pass in 1,000 characters, that extra characters can actually be put on the heap and actually executed at the OS level. Well, all that changed for Oracle is, well, they just check to make sure the input's less than 250 characters. If it's not, they actually start raising an error. That's a typical fix for an Oracle CPU bug. So the risk of it breaking something is very low for the security patch updates. The difference between the security patch updates and the PSU updates are security patch updates are only the security fixes. So in this case, when we looked at the April 2013 CPU for 11.202, if you look at the SPU patch, that includes 29 fixes. There's only 29 security bugs, and it fixes 29 security bugs. Well, for the patch set update, the patch set update is security fixes and priority fixes. And for the same quarter, the PSU is 409 patches. So the PSU contains many, many more fixes than just security fixes. The other problem with PSU patches is that once you apply a PSU, you always have to apply PSUs in the future, because PSUs are actually minor version upgrades, whereas SPUs are just the security fixes and don't really change the version number. We always get the question as well, if I'm applying PSUs and SPUs, which one should I apply? If you know what one-off database patches are, so if you constantly are having to apply little teeny database patches to fix minor database bugs, PSUs actually can be very helpful because they include a lot of those fixes you'd be applying. If you don't know what a one-off database patch is, I would always recommend you apply an SPU because you want to have the minimal changes to the database because therefore you have lower testing, it's easier to apply, it's quicker to apply, less likelihood something else will break. So the first thing you should be always doing is getting up to date and making sure when you're doing database upgrades and installations, you're not falling behind. At least you're up to the latest level when you've done that piece. Now we're assuming you haven't been able to apply since you actually did your last database upgrade or your installation. So now, what are some of the solutions that I'm falling far behind? I've got 11.202. When I installed it, I installed the latest CPU patch, but now I'm maybe a year behind. What should I be doing? How should I be protecting the database? Should I be just assuming the risk that I've got, in this case, 29 unpatched security vulnerabilities? Or should I actually be doing something proactively to try to block and prevent those security vulnerabilities from being exploited? So there's a number of different ways you can do that, and we'll kind of walk through where's my highest risk and what should I be doing to protect against that risk. The first thing is an unauthenticated user. We're assuming your database is only on the internal network. Anyone on the call today who has exposed their database to the internet, if you've got port 1521 open on the internet, that's very foolish to do. You should only be limiting that database and all Oracle databases and virtually any database, be it SQL Server, Sybase, or anything else, should never be exposing those. There's just too many security vulnerabilities, too many issues to expose those to the internet. And most organizations, we seldom ever see that. We will see that occasionally in a higher education environment. So assuming that your database is only limited to your internal network, basically an unauthenticated user can basically at will bring down your database. They're basically will be able to send a couple packets to the database listener, and the database listener will crash. In this case, there's 7 different vulnerabilities in an 11.202 database if you don't have it patched. And probably every other CPU, there's at least one denial of service vulnerability. So it's pretty easy to bring down access to a database. And really the way to fix that problem is to limit direct access to the database. Our #1 security recommendation for Oracle databases is to limit direct access. If I can't connect to a database, I can't hack it. It becomes very, very difficult. I then have to start going through the web applications or other things that are using the application and the database to actually attack it. But if I'm limiting direct database access, so this is basically someone connecting with SQL Plus, SQL Developer, direct SQLnet access, what you need to do is block access to that. And if I'm blocking access to it, very few of these security vulnerabilities can be exploited. And there's certain cases where I need to allow some users. So when we're talking about limiting access, now I have to pick a different way to actually somehow authenticate those people and only allow in the people. But having unfettered access to the database listener by everybody on your network, be it 1,000 people, 10,000 people. We've got one client that basically has 500,000 people on their internal network. It's very important for them to basically block access, because any one of those users could basically go after the database and bring it down just being an unauthenticated user. And there's a lot of different ways they can also get in, because if you can get access to the database listener, now they can try all the standard database accounts. So now let's say you forgot to change the DBMSNP password, the default is DBMSNP, somebody can potentially now connect to that account and try to get into the database, and now they become a lowly privileged user, or maybe a moderately privileged user depending on the database account. So now hopefully we've blocked access to the database, and I'll kind of talk about some of those strategies in a second. But some of the other things that you can do now to hopefully prevent lowly privileged users from accessing the database is first use named only accounts. I can't tell you how many times we see people have generic accounts on the database. So they have a read-only account that they basically open up to the world. A lot of times they don't even change the password. It's usually some default password. The account, like in an Oracle E-Business Suite environment, is apps read. The password tends to be apps read. So really limit the access for generic lowly privileged accounts. So those lowly privileged accounts typically have create session privilege, maybe access to a few key tables, and have a generic password. Those people can all take over the database. There's enough security vulnerabilities for even the lowest privileged user to take over the entire database. So the key here is have named only accounts. Do not have generic read-only accounts. For moderately privileged users, there's not a lot of reason for someone to be able to create tables, create procedures in your production environment. I can't tell you how often we see users being given create procedure. Well, you should be limiting the privileges in production. Well, give them unfettered access in development, maybe test environment, but limit those users in production, because they can basically take over the entire production database fairly easily. So again, we're trying to now limit the risk. I know I have to allow that person access to the database. I'm not applying security patches. At least I know who they are, that they're maybe hopefully a trusted user. But now I'm actually decreasing their privileges in production, so they potentially can't exploit more security vulnerabilities. And then the final scenario is the highly privileged user. So I've got a potentially DBA. How do I actually limit their access so they can't exploit security vulnerabilities and actually extend their privileges? So hopefully they may be just responsible for controlling one application, and I don't want them to have access to the 3 or 4 other applications I have in the one database. Well, the key solution there is using database vault, potentially implementing an external auditing solution. Another area is 2 of these security vulnerabilities. In the example we're using, 2 out of the 29 required local OS authentication. On a production database, a non-DBA should never have OS access to the database server. Maybe the application server, but to the database server, you should be very much limiting that to the Unix or Linux administrators and the DBAs. You should really avoid ever having DBAs or any type of end user actually having OS level authentication, because there are some security vulnerabilities. There are not a lot of them. In this case, it was 2 out of 29 in our example that allow you to take over the database by having read access to the Oracle executables and things like that. So these are some of the scenarios and some of the things you can do to mitigate some of the security vulnerabilities by the type of user and the level of risk. So when we talk about limiting database access, I love giving a webinar. It's really easy for me to say, oh yeah, just limit database access. This is our top security recommendation. This is the thing that you should be doing, and this really eliminates a significant amount of risk in your database environment. The problem is it's very, very hard to do. If you take a typical database, you've got all kinds of different connections. You've got application connections. There's your DBAs connecting to do maintenance. You've got interfaces connecting. You've got reporting tools. There is a lot connecting to production database environments. And then now we're adding in the ad hoc users. The ad hoc users are probably your largest risk, because even with just a few tables that they may have read access to, they can easily take over the entire database. So the key is trying to limit that access, first to eliminate the unauthenticated users, and then to make sure I know who's connecting to the database, that they're really truly the users I want accessing, that at least I have some level of trust in. The first and probably the best way to do it is implementing some sort of enterprise firewall and VPN solution for your data center. Typically, you should be putting a firewall in front of your data center, so basically your entire network can't connect directly to the database. You're at least limiting access to port 1521 or whatever port you've changed your TMS listener to, and you're trying to really reduce that access to the database. And think of this as a funnel. I've got maybe 10,000 people in my internal network. Well, 10,000 people don't need direct access to your database. Now I've actually limited it down to maybe 100 people. That's a dramatic risk reduction. If someone hacks into your network, basically installs some malware on one of your secretary's desktops because they clicked on the wrong email, they'll scan for port 1521 and I try to identify your Oracle databases, and then they'll be able to attack and be able to bring it down. That's a scenario that happens to a lot of different customers. So now what I'm trying to do is, okay, I've at least limited that threat. I've hopefully now know who's connecting because I put in some sort of solution. And the best way is you basically block off the data center, you block off port 1521, and then I have a second part of that solution to allow access by the right people. That way, and there's really two ways that most people do this. One is you implement a VPN solution. So just like you're VPNing into your internal network, you have to VPN into the data center. And that VPN access then gives you access to different servers. Another way people often do this is they actually have what they call a jump server. So I'm running a Citrix server or a Windows Terminal server, and I have to be able to sign on to that machine that has access to the servers in the data center. That's a pretty aggressive solution. That's more of an enterprise-wide solution for your data center. A second way to do it, if you're just doing it for individual databases, is there's actually 3 different solutions for if you're just doing it database by database. The first one is free. It's included with the database, is the valid node checking. So as part of the SQLnet TNS configuration, you can actually list IP addresses that are allowed to connect to the database. This is pretty powerful. It works very well if you know what the IP addresses are. But it becomes very difficult to in most environments because, well, the DBAs are, you use DHCP, so IP addresses are dynamically assigned and things like that. I don't see this implemented very often. If you know you have a database that's very critical and you know exactly what IP addresses should be connecting to it, it's a very quick and dirty solution. It works very, very well. Another method is Oracle Connection Manager. Again, Oracle Connection Manager is included with your database, so you've got this for free. Oracle Connection Manager provides more capabilities than just using valid node checking. You can actually do ranges of IP addresses. It's a little bit more flexible on the naming. And Connection Manager works by acting as a SQLnet proxy. So basically what it does is it takes all the connections and then filters it through some rules and then allows you to connect to the different databases. And finally, an add-on product, Oracle Database Vault, provides a similar functionality, but you can even extend it out farther to allow IP address, time of day. There's lots of different things you can do with Oracle Database Vault. That is a very expensive add-on, though. But those are 4 different solutions to allow you to limit direct database access. This is kind of, if you're going to do anything in your database environment, limiting access to the databases provides you a huge amount of security benefit. Dramatically reduces the risk of both just hacking in general and the risk of security vulnerabilities. If I can't connect to the database, it's very, very hard to exploit an Oracle security vulnerability. And we actually have some customers who don't, based on their environment, if they're like an FDA certified organization, that it's very hard for them to make changes. By blocking significant access to the database and only allowing in applications in the DBAs, you've reduced the risk to almost 0 of exploiting security vulnerabilities. So this is very powerful, and very few Oracle customers do it. So that was for the Oracle database. So we kind of walked through why people aren't applying Oracle database security patches. We walked through some of the risk and how significant it is and provided some solutions. Now what we'll do is talk about the Oracle E-Business Suite. Since a lot of people on the call today have Oracle E-Business Suite environments, and some of these suggestions are also valid for other web applications that you're not patching on a regular basis. So we'll walk through the same type of analysis we did for the Oracle database, and do the same thing, but in a little different fashion for the Oracle E-Business Suite. Instead of having database accounts, now we're mostly concerned about application accounts. And there's really two scenarios in the E-Business Suite. If you're running E-Business Suite externally or just internally. Most people run it just internally, but there's a lot of external environments out there. And the way we define an external environment is you're running it on the internet. And there's a lot of certified iModules. So if you're running iSupplier, iRecruitment, iStore, iSupport, basically what you're doing is allowing users on the internet to access your E-Business Suite environment. And they can log in directly and do things like suppliers, entering invoices and things like that. So if you're running in the iSupplier or iStore, you have a very different risk profile if you're running internally. Again, think of the funnel. Now I've opened up my Oracle E-Business Suite environment to 1 billion people on the internet versus just maybe those 10,000 people on my internal network. So it's a very different risk profile, and we'll kind of walk through those different scenarios. And again, it's the same type. Is somebody authenticated or not authenticated? So if they're authenticated, that means they have a valid application account. And in terms of most of the security vulnerabilities, it really doesn't matter what privileges they have, what responsibilities they have. If you just a few responsibilities can take over the entire database. And most of the security vulnerabilities are in generic parts of the application, like application object library. Probably 80% or maybe 60 to 80% are in common modules versus in specific modules like general ledger or fixed assets. The vast majority are in the login portions, the online help, the standard components of E-Business Suite. So also very similar for the Oracle database, the E-Business Suite also includes CPUs. So again, the first thing you should be doing is looking at what version you have. So when you do an application upgrade, you may be reverting your CPU version back. So just like the database, each version has an included CPU, and here's kind of the different version. So if you just installed 12.1.3, you're starting off with July 2010 for your CPU version. So when you're doing an upgrade, you may be reverting or you may not. Compared to the database is very absolute. Every single time you do a database upgrade and apply any kind of database version patch, you're resetting your CPU level. That's not necessarily true for the Oracle E-Business Suite. The Oracle E-Business Suite, every single file is versioned. So if you kind of look at the header, if you kind of bring up any file within the E-Business Suite, you'll actually see a header version within that. Oracle is very good about doing that. You can actually search for those version numbers on Metalink. You can look through all the different patches, and there's a file that starts with a F that actually tells you the version for each file being patched. So depending on what version you have and what type of upgrade you're doing, matters on how the CPU fixes are being handled. So the first scenario is if you're just doing an upgrade within a major version, so let's say 11.5.5 to 11.5.5, almost every CPU fix will always stay there. So if you've got 11.5.9 and you upgrade to 11.5.10, 90 to 95% of the CPU fixes will stay in place. You won't overwrite them like you would in the Oracle database. However, a few fixes may be reversed, and that's just purely a timing issue. If there was a fix and a patch released, and then all of a sudden then they did a CPU, it really kind of matters on just timing-wise, but very few CPUs. So if you're just doing a minor version upgrade, basically a maintenance pack, you really don't have to worry about the CPU fixes being reversed. If you're doing a major upgrade from like 11i to 12, the versioning within 11i and R12, the version numbers completely changed. So if you actually look through the different version numbers, you'll see for 11i it was 115. For R12 it's 120. So every single CPU fix will be overridden when you actually do a major upgrade. So even if you've applied the latest CPU to 11.5.10.2 and you upgrade to 11.12.1.3, you'll actually revert yourself back to July 2010, even though you had the latest applied. If you're doing a version upgrade within 12, so from 12.0 to 12.1, most of the fixes will be reversed. There is some different versioning within the eBusiness Suite R12 versions. So a lot of them will be reversed, maybe 50 to 60%. Not all of them, though. It just, again, depends on timing, depends on when things were upgraded, and things like that. But again, when you're doing an upgrade in R12 from 12.0 to 12.1, you do need to reapply the latest CPU. So it's a little bit more complicated here, but again, the first thing you should always be doing is don't start behind. So whenever you do an eBusiness Suite install or upgrade, always make sure you've got the latest CPU installed. So now let's take the mapping. So similar that we did for the database, we'll actually do this for 12.1.3. So the scenario here is you have installed 12.1.3 and you never applied a CPU patch. So basically your CPU version is July 2010. So how many security bugs are there? Well, in this case, there's 46 different security bugs that you have unpatched in your environment. And what I did here was now break it out by your type of user. So again, if you're running externally one of the iModules like iSupply or iStore, your risk is significant because you've got a billion different people that can connect to that URL if they can find it and exploit any of the security bugs. And most of the Oracle eBusiness Suite security bugs don't require authentication. So they're very easy to exploit. As long as I know the URL, I don't need a valid application account. And in eBusiness Suite, a lot of the vulnerabilities, again, in this case, even if I have an authenticated user for an external environment, 3 out of the 5 security vulnerabilities only required any valid session. So if I'm running iStore, if I ever sign in to iStore, or if I do certain things, I'll automatically get a guest account, and then using that guest account, I can exploit security vulnerabilities. So authenticated and unauthenticated users on an external environment really isn't that meaningful. But again, 16 of the 18 security vulnerabilities for unauthenticated security vulnerabilities are high risk. So people can basically start executing code as the apps user, which is very, very powerful. So I can basically take over your database remotely if you're running iSupply and not applying patches. Internally, again, these numbers don't add up to the 46 because the same bugs that are available externally are also available internally. If you're unauthenticated, I've got 34 different security bugs that don't require any authentication, and only 12 actually require some sort of authentication. So there's a lot of different security bugs here, and most of them are high risk. And many are SQL injection bugs that can actually be exploited, and actually you can run SQL code against the database as the apps user. That's a very powerful security bug. And also in this case, I'm assuming with these counts that the URL firewall is enabled. If you don't have the URL firewall enabled, which limits access to only certain modules, you actually got all the modules running on the internet, so actually you would have 46 different bugs running on the internet. So it's very important to do the DMZ configuration right. So what are some of the solutions here that you need to be looking at? Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of great choices. If you have an external authenticated user, the first thing you need to do is enable the URL firewall. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Another option is basically we have a product called App Defend. So Integrity basically wrote a web application firewall that's very specific to the Oracle eBusiness Suite. And every time a CPU comes out, we actually include a rule that blocks that specific CPU security bug. To help block external authenticated users, you want to basically limit the number of responsibilities available externally. So there's a whole specific way you enable external responsibilities, and you don't allow the vast majority of your responsibilities to be accessible externally. So people can't log in as sysadmin and use the system administrator responsibility externally. What you do is you limit to just what is running externally. So you might just have an iSupplier supplier user. You might have just an iStore user, things like that. Internally, the only real method to block some of the security vulnerabilities is our App Defend product. It's very difficult to actually patch these without applying the CPU patches. And then finally, limit access to privileged responsibilities. A lot of people don't do a very good job about going through responsibilities and limiting access to the privileged ones. You can get yourself into big trouble by having lots and lots of super users. So if you don't do periodic reviews of responsibilities, segregation of duties analysis, things can be a lot more open than you really realize. One of the big things for limiting the exposure to critical patch updates is actually doing the DMZ configuration correctly. So if you're running iSupply or iStore or some of the other iModules on the internet, it's very important you do the configuration appropriately. And this includes Appendix E of these two documents. That is the URL firewall, which limits access to many, many modules. So if you're running externally and you haven't gone through these two MetaLink notes, one for R12 and one for 11i in great detail and implemented every single step, you're really exposing your environment and probably allowing access to more of those security vulnerabilities than is necessary. And I'll just cover really quickly what some of the DMZ configuration does is typically in an Oracle Business Suite environment, you've got over 20,000 web pages available. And basically, if you're running iSupply or externally, well, you don't need 20,000 web pages on the internet. And if you haven't gone through the DMZ configuration appropriately, you've got 20,000 web pages running. You've got Oracle Student System. You've got Oracle Manufacturing. Even though you may not be using those modules, those will be available externally. And so the DMZ configuration dramatically reduces that footprint on the internet to just what's required. So instead of 20,000 web pages, I may be just running about 300 now. Very dramatic reduction in risk and scope. And a lot of security vulnerabilities are in those other things that should be blocked with the URL firewall. And so, again, one way to reduce risk is don't allow people access to it. And then the other key way to reduce risk is using a web application firewall. For eBusiness Suite, all the commercial ones available on the market don't know about eBusiness Suite. They have very few rules that are related, and that's why Integrity actually wrote a web application firewall specifically for eBusiness Suite. So we attempt to block a lot of the things in the eBusiness Suite. That's the problem. But we also block all the application security vulnerabilities. So every time a new CPU comes out, we do a detailed analysis and actually review it and actually write rules to block those security vulnerabilities directly. So if you can't apply security patches, AppDefend is actually a very good way to prevent a lot of those security vulnerabilities. Then we also prevent a lot of the web attacks before they're patched in Oracle. So we'll try to prevent the SQL injection or the cross-site scripting vulnerabilities generically, even though we don't know where they are in the application. So that's kind of a high-level overview going through talking about Oracle security patches and what you can do if you can't apply the security patches. It's always best to apply them, but there's a lot of organizations can't keep up. So if you're trying to protect your environment and you are a quarter behind, 2 quarters, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, there's some things you can do to reduce the risk in the environment when you can't patch. It's very important. These are very critical security bugs, and people can take over the entire Oracle database or the Oracle eBusiness Suite very easily. And a lot of the exploit code is published on the internet. So they just have to do a Google search and get access to your database and basically take it over fairly readily. So we'll open up to some questions now.
Thank you, Steve. The first question, are all the CPUs equal in terms of importance?
Generally, the CPUs are just always has one high-risk security vulnerability. Out of the 6 years that Oracle's been doing this, we analyze each quarter, and there's only 1 quarter out of 6 years that we kind of deemed optional. But every single one besides that, so out of 24 plus CPUs, there's only one of those that we kind of viewed that was potentially optional. All the others have always been high risk, because remember, these are always bundled, so there's not just one security vulnerability. There may be 4 or 5 in each CPU. So generally assume every CPU is critical, and moving forward, we are assuming for at least the next 2 years, almost every CPU moving forward will be critical. We've got a number of security vulnerabilities open. We know there's at least 100 security vulnerabilities open with Oracle from other security researchers. So every CPU tends to be critical.
Next question. We are in process of moving our database servers off-site. How can I know I am not at risk of having an unauthorized user access the database?
It's very difficult when you are moving off-site to an outsourcer, to an application service provider, unless you are putting within the contract certain limitations. Again, most of these same recommendations apply if you're running it on-site or off-site. Limiting access to the database and trying to limit access within the outsourcer. We were involved in one scenario where I actually reviewed with the outsourcer. They had about 200 DBAs on staff, fairly large organization. All 200 DBAs had access to every single database. We thought that was a little excessive, and again, this is a scenario where if you can provide that level of security control, if people can't access the database, it's very hard for them to exploit it. So think of the funnel. Try to reduce that layer of exposure dramatically. You don't want 10,000 people being able to connect to your database server. If you know it's 100, that's a different risk profile than if you've got 10,000. And the goal is to hopefully get it down to just your DBAs and just have a named set of DBAs connecting, in this case maybe 5 or 10, not 200 at the outsourcer, and have them provide that layer of security control.
All right, next question. We are not applying CPUs because our security team has not requested them to be applied. If they don't think the CPUs are important, why should I as a DBA?
This is actually a pretty typical problem. There's the IT security team, internal audit within an organization. They typically don't have a focus today on databases and ERP packages like the e-business suite. Typically, the IT security teams, they care about networks, they care about the network perimeter, they're all worried about firewalls and things like that, and they really don't tend to focus in on the Oracle database. Even though these are all critical security bugs, they just tend not to have the focus. And it's your database, and who's going to be ultimately responsible if someone hacks in and steals all your sensitive data, enters fraudulent transactions and things like that. Most likely it's going to fall on the DBA team. So if I was a DBA, I think you should be proactive about security and really bringing this to attention. And the way to get IT management to prioritize these security patches is to work with your internal audit team, your IT security team, and say, hey, we've got critical unpatched security vulnerabilities that put us at dramatic risk within the organization, and we need to have these addressed, and we need to have IT management understand that we need the resources prioritized, the time to have downtime, the time to apply the patches, the pause in the application implementations and things like that, to do this on a quarterly or every other quarter basis. You should be at least applying security patches twice a year, hopefully quarterly, but we understand that's not realistic for most organizations. It's just such a time commitment. So if you're doing it maybe twice a year, that's at least reducing your risk and then trying to implement some of these security controls we've talked about today.
Next question. How truly effective are your recommendations compared to applying the CPUs?
If someone can't connect to the database, it's very hard for them to hack it. So if you are appropriately limiting access to just the necessary applications and the DBAs, I would say it's pretty hard for someone to actually get in unless they can find another security vulnerability, maybe in an application, a web application like a SQL injection attack. Or they can find an avenue to attack the DBA's machine or something like that. But if you're blocking access, it's actually pretty effective controls. So even if you are applying CPUs, putting some of these controls in just give you another very effective layer. Both are pretty effective. But once you let somebody into the database, if you're giving them an account on the database, there's not a lot you can do to protect against that person taking over the entire database. It's very, very difficult at that point to fully block access, because as soon as a new vulnerability comes up and it's published on the internet in a public package, it's pretty easy for someone to find that information with a Google search and take over. But if you're not allowing that type of access, it's very difficult. But once somebody has a database account, it's tough to stop them from taking over the entire database. And it happens every single quarter that there's new vulnerabilities that are easy to find because people publish out the information on how to exploit it very easily on the internet. So it's pretty easy to do.
All right, thank you, Steve. And I think that concludes our session for today. And I want to thank everybody for attending our session. We'll be taking off the July and August. Our next webinar will be sometime in September. Again, stay tuned for that. And again, thank you everybody for attending today, and have the rest of a great day. Thank you.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected.